Have you ever noticed that some of the things people say are in the Bible actually aren't there at all? You've probably heard someone say that money is the root of all evil, or that God helps those who help themselves. You might even have these phrases hanging on a plaque in your kitchen. But here's the catch. Neither of those things is actually in the scriptures. In fact, one of them comes from a Greek fable, and the other is a common misquote of a much deeper warning. We are living in a world where centuries of tradition, catchy slogans, and even Hollywood movies have blended into our faith, creating a version of belief that sometimes departs significantly from the original source. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on some of the most persistent and, frankly, disturbing misunderstandings that have managed to take root in modern faith. We aren't just looking at minor typos. We are looking at foundational ideas that change how people see themselves, how they treat others, and how they perceive the divine. If you want to know what is actually in the text versus what has been added by years of human tradition, you are in the right place. Let's get into the things that many people still follow today that might be completely backwards. One of the most pervasive ideas circulating in modern circles is the concept that being a person of faith acts as a sort of golden ticket to a life of material wealth and physical ease. You've seen it on late-night television and in massive stadiums. The idea that if you just have enough belief, or if you sow a specific financial seed, you will be rewarded with a bigger house, a faster car, and a bank account that never runs dry. This is often called the prosperity gospel, and it's one of the most troubling distortions of the original message. When you look at the historical context of the early followers, they weren't exactly living in mansions. Most of them faced extreme hardship, lived in poverty, and were social outcasts. The original teachings actually warned people that the pursuit of riches could be a massive distraction from true spiritual growth. The idea that the creator of the universe is a cosmic vending machine waiting for you to put in a prayer and pull out a paycheck is a relatively modern invention, fueled more by consumer culture than by ancient wisdom. It creates a disturbing dynamic where people who are struggling financially feel like it's a sign of a lack of faith, which only adds a layer of shame to their already difficult situation. But let's talk about another big one. The "God won't give you more than you can handle" phrase. People say this to comfort those who are going through a personal crisis, but it's actually a complete misunderstanding of a verse about temptation. The reality of the human experience represented in the scriptures is that people are constantly overwhelmed. They are often given much more than they can handle on their own. The whole point of the narrative is that when you hit that breaking point where you can no longer carry the weight, you are supposed to look beyond yourself for strength. Telling someone that they should be able to handle their deepest struggles alone because God said so can actually lead to a sense of failure and isolation. It's a well-meaning sentiment that often ends up crushing the person it's meant to help. Then there is the concept of cleanliness is next to godliness. This is a classic example of a phrase that sounds so official that everyone assumes it's in the book of Leviticus or somewhere in the New Testament. In reality, it was popularized by a sermon in the 1700s. While hygiene is obviously a good thing, elevated it to a spiritual requirement creates a disturbing hierarchy. Throughout history, this mindset has been used to look down on people living in poverty or those who don't have access to the same resources. The original message was much more focused on the state of a person's heart and their actions toward their neighbor than on how often they scrub their floors. When we turn societal standards of middle-class comfort into spiritual mandates, we start to lose sight of the people who were originally championed, the marginalized, and the forgotten. Now, let's dive into something that often gets portrayed in movies and popular culture: the way we view the afterlife. If you ask the average person on the street what happens when they pass away, they might describe a scene where they turn into an angel, get a harp, and sit on a cloud for eternity. This is a mix of Greek philosophy, cartoons, and Renaissance art, but it's not really the core of the ancient belief system. The original concept was much more grounded and physical. It spoke of a restoration of the earth, a world where things were made right again, and a physical existence rather than a ghostly one in the clouds. The idea that we become angels is actually an ancient misunderstanding. Humans and celestial beings were always described as completely different categories of creation. When we focus on the cloud version of the future, we often stop caring about the world we are living in right now. If this world is just a temporary waiting room, then why bother fixing the environment or standing up for justice? But the original view was that this world matters immensely because it is the stage for a grand restoration. Speaking of movies, let's talk about the way we perceive the adversary. Popular culture has given us a version of the darker side of faith that looks like a man in a red suit with horns and a pitchfork, ruling over a subterranean cavern filled with fire. This imagery is primarily drawn from Dante's Inferno and Milton's Paradise Lost, rather than the actual text. In the scriptures, the depiction is much more subtle and, in some ways, more frightening. The adversary is described as a deceiver, or an accuser, who often appears as an angel of light. The disturbing part is that by focusing on the cartoonish version of evil, people often miss the real thing: injustice, greed, and the subtle ways we justify hurting others. If we think evil only exists in a dark basement somewhere, we might not notice when it starts influencing our own attitudes or our communities. Another belief that lingers in many circles is the idea that everything happens for a reason. While this is meant to provide a sense of order in a chaotic world, it can be extremely damaging. When a natural disaster strikes or someone experiences a personal tragedy, telling them it's all part of a specific, predetermined plan can feel cold and heartless. It implies that the divine is the direct author of suffering. The ancient texts, however, talk a lot about a world that is groaning or out of joint. They describe a reality where bad things happen because the world is currently fractured, not because every single event is a meticulously planned move on a chessboard. There is a difference between a creator who can bring good out of a bad situation and a creator who causes the bad situation on purpose. Confusing the two can lead to a very disturbing view of the divine character. Let's talk about the anger is always a sin myth. Many people grow up believing that to be a good person of faith, you have to be constantly smiling and never show frustration. But if you look at the life of the central figure of the faith, you see moments of intense, righteous anger. There's a famous scene where he clears out a marketplace in a temple because people were taking advantage of the poor. Anger, when directed at injustice or cruelty, isn't described as a flaw. It's described as a necessary response. The disturbing part of the never be angry belief is that it silences people who should be speaking up. It turns faith into a tool for passivity, making people feel guilty for being upset about things that are genuinely wrong in the world. Then we have the money is the root of all evil misquote. The actual verse says that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. That is a massive distinction. Money itself is just a tool, like a hammer or a car. It's the obsession with it, the elevation of it above human people and spiritual values, that creates the problem. When we simplify it to money is bad, we create a strange culture where people feel guilty for being successful, even if they are using their resources to help others. Simultaneously, it allows people to ignore more complex forms of wrongdoing because they think as long as they aren't rich, they are doing fine. The focus should be on the heart's priorities, not the balance of the bank account. Another belief that can get pretty dark is the curse of certain groups idea. Throughout history, people have taken obscure or poetic passages and used them to justify prejudice against specific ethnicities or groups of people. For instance, for centuries, a certain passage was used to justify the mistreatment of people of African descent, claiming they were under a divine shadow. This is a complete and utter distortion of the text that has caused immeasurable harm. It's disturbing how easily human bias can be dressed up in religious language to make it look official. The actual message of the scriptures is one of radical inclusion, breaking down the barriers between different cultures and backgrounds. Whenever a belief system starts telling you that some people are inherently lesser because of their birth, it has moved far away from the original path. What about the idea that God helps those who help themselves? As I mentioned earlier, this actually comes from an ancient Greek fable by Aesop and was later popularized by Benjamin Franklin. In contrast, much of the actual message in the scriptures is about the Creator helping those who cannot help themselves. It's about looking out for the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, people who are at the very bottom of the social ladder. The help yourself mindset fits perfectly into a rugged, individualistic culture, but it's the opposite of the communal, sacrificial love that was originally taught. This belief can lead to a disturbing lack of empathy for people who are stuck in systems they can't escape on their own. Let's also look at the way people view faith itself. Some people treat faith like it's a form of magic, that if you just believe hard enough, you can bend reality to your will. They think of it as a mental state you have to achieve to get what you want. But in the original context, the word used for faith was much closer to allegiance or trust. It wasn't about trying to manifest a miracle. It was about staying loyal to a set of values and a person even when things were going wrong. When we turn faith into a psychological trick to get results, we turn the relationship into a contract rather than a connection. It becomes about what we can get rather than who we are becoming. The belief that Christians should never judge is another one that gets taken out of context. The warning was actually about hypocritical judging. looking at a speck in someone else's eye while ignoring a log in your own. It wasn't a command to stop using your brain or to stop discerning right from wrong. In fact, people were encouraged to call out injustice and support accountability within their communities. The disturbing result of the never judge belief is a culture where nobody can be held responsible for their actions. It creates an environment where harmful behavior can flourish because everyone is too afraid of being judgmental to say anything. True accountability is actually an act of love, because it seeks the best for everyone involved. Another area where things get a bit confusing is the view of the body. There is a long-standing tradition in some circles that the physical body is bad or dirty, and that only the soul is good. This actually comes more from Gnostic movements and Plato than from the Hebrew and Christian traditions. The original view was that the physical world, including our bodies, was created as something very good. The hope wasn't to escape the body, but for the body to be renewed. When we believe the physical world doesn't matter, we often neglect our health, our environment, and the physical needs of others. But the central story of the faith is about a creator who became physical, which is the ultimate validation of the material world. How about the God as a vengeful grandfather image? This is the belief that the divine is just waiting for you to make a mistake so you can be zapped. This creates a culture of fear and performance. You find people who are constantly anxious, trying to follow 1,000 rules just to stay on the good side. This is a far cry from the descriptions of a father who runs to meet his lost son, or a shepherd who goes out to find the one sheep that wandered away. The disturbing part of the vengeful belief is that it makes people hide their flaws instead of seeking help. It destroys the very honesty that is needed for genuine personal change. Let's look at the rapture concept. This is the idea that at any moment, all the good people will vanish from the earth, leaving behind a world of chaos. While this is a huge part of modern fiction and certain denominations, it's actually a very recent development in the history of the faith, popping up in the mid-1800s. For the first 1,800 years of the tradition, this wasn't how people understood the future. The older view was that the followers of the faith were called to stay in the world to help transform it, not to wait for an escape pod. The escape mentality can lead to a disturbing apathy toward the future. If you think you're leaving tomorrow, why would you care about climate change or sustainable systems? But if you believe the goal is to bring the values of the divine into the present, your perspective on the world changes entirely. Another persistent belief is that every single person mentioned in the Bible is a hero we should emulate. This is how we get Bible heroes coloring books for kids. But if you actually read the stories, most of these people were deeply flawed and did some pretty terrible things. David was a great king, but he was also an adulterer and a plotter. Peter was the lead disciple, but he denied knowing his friend when things got dangerous. The point of the stories wasn't that these people were perfect heroes. It was that the divine could work through very messy, very broken humans. When we pretend they were perfect, we create an impossible standard for ourselves. We feel like we can't be part of the story unless we are flawless, which is the exact opposite of what the book is trying to say. The concept of, "the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it," is also quite problematic. While it sounds pious, it often ignores the fact that we all have to interpret what we read. The text was written in ancient languages, in cultures very different from our own, and uses many different genres like poetry, law, and history. If you read a poem like it's a science textbook, you're going to get some very strange ideas. For example, when a psalm says the trees of the field clap their hands, nobody thinks trees actually have palms and fingers. We understand it's a metaphor, but people often pick and choose which parts to take literally and which to take figuratively based on their own biases. The disturbing part is that this simple approach is often used to shut down honest questions and intellectual curiosity. Faith and reason were always meant to work together, not to be in conflict. There is also the belief that suffering is always a punishment. You see this in some circles where, if someone gets sick or loses their job, people start asking what secret sin they must have committed. This is an ancient idea that was actually directly challenged in the Book of Job and by the central figure of the New Testament. They made it clear that bad things can happen to good people, and it isn't always a direct consequence of their actions. Believing that suffering is always a punishment creates a very cruel environment where victims are blamed for their own pain. It's a way for people who are doing well to feel like they've earned their safety, which is a very dangerous form of pride. Speaking of pride, let's talk about the belief that our group is the only ones going to heaven. This religious tribalism has led to centuries of conflict and exclusion. It turns faith into a private club rather than a message for the world. The historical reality is that the early followers were a diverse, messy group from all sorts of backgrounds, many of whom would have been seen as outsiders by the religious leaders of the time. When we start building walls and saying only the people who follow our specific tradition are in, we lose the radical hospitality that the faith was founded on. Another disturbing belief is the just pray it away approach to mental health. For years, people struggling with depression, anxiety, or other mental challenges have been told that they just need to pray more, or that their struggle is a sign of spiritual weakness. This has prevented thousands of people from seeking the professional medical help they need. The truth is that the brain is an organ just like the heart or the lungs. You wouldn't tell someone with a broken leg to just pray it away without going to a doctor. So why do we do it with mental health? This belief has led to a lot of unnecessary suffering and, in some cases, tragic outcomes. We have to recognize that medical science and faith are not enemies. They are different ways of understanding the same world. How about the women should stay silent belief? This is often based on 2 or 3 verses in letters that were written to specific cities facing specific problems. People take those verses and turn them into a universal rule for all time. But if you look at the rest of the text, you see women acting as leaders, teachers, and even being the first people to share the most important news of the entire tradition. In the early house churches, women played a vital roles. When we use a few isolated passages to silence half of the population, we are ignoring the clear historical precedent of the faith. It's disturbing how easily a culture of control can be justified by selective reading. The once saved, always saved versus you can lose it at any second debate is also one that causes a lot of anxiety. Both extremes can be problematic. One can lead to a sense of apathy, where you feel like you can do whatever you want because you have your fire insurance. The other can lead to a constant state of panic, where you feel like one bad thought will ruin your eternity. The original message was much more about a lifelong journey of becoming. The idea that your relationship with the divine is something that grows and matures over time. It's not a one-time transaction, and it's not a tightrope walk over a pit of fire. It's a path. Let's talk about the belief in God's will for your life as a single, narrow path that you have to find like a needle in a haystack. Many young people are paralyzed by the fear that if they pick the wrong job or the wrong city, they will be out of God's will for the rest of their lives. But the biblical concept of will is much more about your character and how you treat people than it is about your specific zip code. If you are acting with love, justice, and humility, you have a lot of freedom in the choices you make. The idea that there is only one right choice for every minor life decision is a recipe for obsession and anxiety. It turns a relationship of freedom into one of constant second-guessing. Then there is the Christians are better than other people belief. This is the most disturbing of all because it contradicts the very core of the message. The entire foundation of the faith is that nobody is better than anyone else. That everyone is in need of grace. When people of faith start acting like they have it all figured out and that they are morally superior to their neighbors, they have become the very thing the central figure of the faith was most critical of. True faith should lead to a deeper sense of humility, not a louder sense of superiority. Another big one. The Bible is a book about how to get to heaven. If you actually look at the word count, the Bible is much more about how to live on earth. It's about how to manage money, how to handle conflict, how to seek justice, and how to build a community. The obsession with the afterlife is a relatively modern focus. The ancient followers were much more interested in the arrival of a new kingdom here and now, a way of life that challenged the power structures of their day. When we make it only about what happens after we pass away, we miss the transformative power of the message for the present moment. How about the idea that God chooses who gets saved and who doesn't in a cold, predestined way? This is a huge theological debate, but at its worst, it makes the creator look like a puppet master who is playing a cruel game. It takes away human agency and makes our choices feel meaningless. The counterview, which is also well supported, is that everyone has the freedom to respond to the invitation. When we move too far toward the puppet master view, we lose the beauty of a relationship that is based on a free choice to love. Another one is the tithe, being a mandatory 10% rule to stay in good standing. In the ancient Hebrew system, there were actually several tithes that ended up being closer to 20 or 30%, and they were used as a social safety net to feed the poor. In the New Testament, the 10% rule isn't actually mandated. Instead, the call is for radical generosity, giving whatever you can from a place of joy to support the community, or turning it into a hard rule or a fee you pay to a church, can be disturbing because it often burdens the people who have the least, while letting the wealthy feel like they've checked the box even if they could easily do more. What about the every word of the King James Bible is perfect belief? This is a very specific modern movement. The King James Version is a masterpiece of English literature, but it was translated in 1611 from the best manuscripts they had asterisk at the time, asterisk. Since then, we have found manuscripts that are much older and closer to the original writings. To say that a translation from the 1600s is more inspired than the original Greek and Hebrew is a strange and modern form of tradition worship. It can lead to some very confusing interpretations because language has changed so much in the last 400 years. There's also the "we should support Israel no matter what they do" belief, which is common in some political religious circles. This is often based on a specific interpretation of a promise made thousands of years ago. But the same prophets who spoke about that land also spent most of their time criticizing the nation's leaders for not looking after the poor and for being unjust. True support for any group of people should include the courage to call them to the highest standards of justice and peace, not a blind endorsement of every political action. The "America is a Christian nation" myth is also one that causes a lot of friction. While the founders were certainly influenced by certain values, they were also influenced by the Enlightenment and deism. They deliberately created a system where there was no state religion so that everyone would have the freedom to believe or not believe. When we try to fuse national identity with religious identity, we end up compromising the religious side. Faith is meant to be a voice that can speak asterisk to asterisk power, not a voice that asterisk is asterisk the power. Another one. Sunday is the only day that is holy. This creates a compartmentalized life where people act one way in a building on Sunday and a completely different way for the other 6 days of the week. The original idea was that all asterisk of life is lived in the presence of the divine. Every meal, every job, every conversation is an opportunity to live out the values of the faith. When we make it only about a 1-hour service, we turn a way of life into a hobby. Finally, let's talk about the belief that the world is getting worse and worse. This leads to a bunker mentality, where people stop trying to make things better because they think the collapse is inevitable. But if you actually look at the data, the world is in many ways much better than it was hundreds of years ago. We have less global violence, more access to food, and better healthcare. Believing that everything is meant to fail can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. We are called to be people of hope, working to make our communities look more like the new kingdom every single day. Why do these beliefs stick around? Because they are easy. It's easier to have a slogan than a relationship. It's easier to have a rule than to seek wisdom. It's easier to blame God's will than to take responsibility for our choices. But the real path, the one laid out in the original stories, is much more challenging and much more beautiful. It's a path of constant questioning, constant growth, and constant love for the world around us. When we strip away these disturbing misunderstandings, what we find isn't a museum of old rules, but a living, breathing movement that is still relevant today. We find a message that values the marginalized, champions the truth, and offers a hope that isn't about escaping the world, but about making it whole. It's a path that doesn't ask you to leave your brain at the door, but to use your heart and your mind to seek out what is true and what is good. So, the next time you hear one of these phrases, take a moment to look a little deeper. Check the context. Faith isn't about having all the right answers. It's about being on the right path, moving toward love and justice. The more we clear away the traditions and the misconceptions, the more we can see the original beauty of the message. We are all on this journey together, and the more we seek the truth, the more we find that the truth actually sets us free. The story of the faith is still being written, and we are the ones holding the pen. Let's make sure we are writing a story that is true to the original ink, a story of grace, humility, and a relentless hope for a world made new. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to be honest. And in that honesty, we find a faith that can actually handle the weight of real life.